Big Read, remembering New Zealand cricket's watershed moment. How time flies. It was 40 years ago tomorrow that one of New Zealand cricket's most famous occasions began at the Basin Reserve. 5 days later, a significant duck had been broken and New Zealand's cricketers had knocked down a door which had been jammed shut for 48 years. Future New Zealand cricketers should forever owe a debt to this team who showed them what was possible. Every other Test nation to that point had been beaten. In 48 years since making their first appearance as a Test nation, against England, New Zealand had not won a single match of the 47 between the countries. 24 had been drawn, 23 lost. Certainly, there had been close shaves, notably at Trent Bridge and Lords in 1973 when, respectively, New Zealand fell 38 runs short of what would have been one of the all-time great chases, and but for a dropped catch or two on the final day, would have won at Cricket's HQ. When England arrived at the Basin, it was for the first Test of a 3-match series, and they were coming off a tour of Pakistan, and without their tour captain Mike Brearley, ruled out after breaking an arm. They'd left the captaincy to Jeff Boycott, a self-obsessed, skilled and redoubtable Yorkshireman. Opposing him was Mark Burgess, the Auckland batsman also chosen to lead his country for the first time, as the 14th Test skipper. Burgess was a reluctant skipper. The previous two, Bevan Kingdon, who remained in the side, and Glenn Turner, had ruled themselves out. It took about 4 phone calls from manager Frank Cameron to persuade me I was the best available of those who remained. I wasn't even the captain of Auckland that season either, Burgess recalled. I was more serious about what I was doing in my career really than in cricket. The main thing was your occupation and we didn't play that much. I probably had a couple of club games then we assembled. Burgess knew it was a terrific honour. I still look back on it very fondly, but it was a testing time for me. He's sure the captaincy stymied him as a positive, assertive batsman, being conscious of leading by example from a batting discipline perspective. New Zealand had 2 new caps, a shaggy-haired, mustachioed opener John Wright, and a tight-fisted left-arm spinner Stephen Boog. Both played important parts in what followed. The longest-serving players were Kingdon and fast bowler Richard Collins, a big, burly and highly competitive left-armer, who made their debut in the same Test and also played their last together later in 1978, fittingly at Lords. Preparations for the Test were, to put it mildly, rudimentary compared with modern times. The team would assemble 2 days before a Test, have a couple of nets and a dinner the night before. I don't ever recall that we had a meeting or discussion before the match, said Boog. If we did, it went in one ear and out the other. Indeed, Boog doesn't recall even being aware New Zealand had never beaten England in a Test when it began. That started to grow as an issue as the game went on. By the end of the 3rd day, it was even Stevens. New Zealand 228, England 215 and the hosts 12 for none at stumps. By then Wright had made a real nuisance of himself to the English, taking a little under 6 hours over 55, but it might just as easily have been a duck. Spectators heard a loud nick as the first ball of the match from tall, mop-head Bob Willis passed left-hander Wright's bat. Not out, said umpire Ralph Gardner, perhaps being buffeted by the winds at his back, and not seeing a deflection. The story goes that when Wright was autographing copies of one of his books a few years ago, Gardner walked up with the mounted ball from that innings and asked him to sign it. Shortly after, Wright's opening partner Robert Anderson got a quick single off Willis to get to the non-striker's end. As Anderson told broadcaster and writer Eric Young several years ago, "As I make my way down to the other end, Willis stands in front of me and says, 'Jumbo, UF.ing stay down this end. It's the other.'" The stubbornness which became a hallmark of Wright's batting for the next 15 years in the national team stood him in good stead as he battled the bowling and the blustery winds to get through the day. Cans were swept along the concourse surrounding the ground, back and forth with the winds. England's bowling attack was strong, but in the Richards, Headley and Collins, with seamer Dale Headley in support, New Zealand knew what they were about too. So all square, then going into the fourth day after a rest day. Then things all changed. New Zealand has serious history for batting collapses. Nothing had changed by 1978. From 82 for 1 they lost 9 for 41, tumbling to 123 all out in just 44.3 overs, a lead of just 136. In a fashion to match the weather, they were simply blown away, chiefly by Willis. "I recall being absolutely bloody furious with how it all happened," Burgess said. "It batted an hour for 6, so contributed nothing, and I really got stuck into the team, myself included, for what had happened." There were strong words. "I produced my equivalent of an Alex Ferguson teacup throwing," he quipped, referring to the legendary Manchester United manager's temper. But away from Burgess' ears another, more significant, conversation was taking place. Collins takes up the story. "Battles, Hadley, and I had a chat before we went back out, and we said, well, let's go and give it to them. The track's a bit unpredictable, let's knock them over." On their way back onto the field in those days, the players' dressing rooms were underneath what is now the Cricket Museum at mid-wicket on the terraces, the pitch at a slightly different angle. The spectators gave the players no mercy. They were booing us, jeering, saying you've wasted an opportunity. They didn't give us a lot of support, Hadley remembered years later. But the afternoon turned into one of the unforgettable sessions in New Zealand Test history. Collins, charging up into a stiff southerly, got things started, yorking the redoubtable Boycott for 1. It is perhaps still the most celebrated single ball in New Zealand Test history. The one true top-class batsman in the England side, the player who would set himself to bat his team to victory, had been swept away. It was a full-length, Boycott shape to play it to the onside and missed it. Collins had dismissed Boycott in the first innings after a marathon 77, and went on to take his wicket twice more in his other 3 innings in the series. "There was always the likelihood to dummy door and get them home," Collins said. "If we could get Boyks, there was a chance." The crowd, sensing the significance of the moment, weighed in from the bank. Others may have dared to dream, but Burgess wasn't among them. He had been down this road several times before, only to see it turn into a dead end. "I had always been more of a pragmatist than a dreamer. It was a little later, when more happened, that it started to dawn on me." Collins modestly played down any personal significance about that wicket. He says he doesn't really remember it that well. "I think I was struggling a wee bit coming into the breeze and might have flighted it a bit like spinner, Buki," he chuckled. Collinge's only take on it was the collective rather than personal. My thoughts were it was a means to win a test. Anytime you can contribute to a win is very satisfying because that's what we're in the game for. Collinge took the next 2 wickets before Hadlee took over. Those were his long warm-up days, starting with a distinctive little sideways shuffle. Paddles was bowling really quick. The pitch was up and down by then. It was really difficult batting, and that's why we had a feeling anything could happen, Boog said. In those days of 8-ball overs, the Hadlee and Collinge bowled 26 of 27 overs between them. Men in walk shorts and white toweling hats clanged big hands together. Hadlee rang round the ground, and he delivered in spades. Wicket-keeper Warren Lee snapped up a one-handed catch low to his right. Ian Botham miscued a hook to be caught by Boog behind square. Phil Edmonds was caught, after a juggle, by John Parker at slip. Boog made his big contribution, running out Bob Taylor with a direct hit from behind square leg. Hadlee punched the air furiously with each wicket, each step closer to what had seemed the unthinkable an hour earlier. At stumps England were 53 for 8, and done. Early morning rain held things up for a time before Hadlee finished the job. Hadlee finished with 6 for 26, Collinge 3 for 35. A race for souvenirs before champagne in the dressing room. Of Hadlee, Boycott said, "I thought he was a majestic bowler, the best corridor bowler I've played against, or seen." Parker was photographed raising a glass of bubbles. The joke was he didn't drink alcohol. Boycott came in, shaking the New Zealand players' hands. "We don't want to be bad losers. The better side won," he said. "He certainly showed great consideration for us and what it meant for New Zealand cricket," Boog said. There were thoughts for all those players who had gone before this 11, outstanding players like Walter Hadlee and Bert Sutcliffe, who had never enjoyed a moment to match this. "I only realised afterwards that it was such a watershed moment," Boog said. It wasn't just a win for the 12 players, including 12th man Ewan Chatfield, it was a win for New Zealand, and on the back of our team were scores of other players who had played before, some of them great players and never experienced what we were. That makes you feel quite humble. There have been a couple of reunions, after 20 and 30 years, and in Christchurch at the end of next month most of them are gathering for a day at the second test against England. Well, not much immediately. New Zealand went to England 4 months later full of optimism after burying that particular bogey. Performance didn't match hopes and England won the series 3-0. But in 1983 New Zealand won a test in England for the first time. The following summer England were shot out in less than 2 days for 82 and 93 at Lancaster Park. In 1986 New Zealand won the series in England 1-0. Australia had been beaten away, then home a season earlier, and New Zealand established a fabulous record throughout the decade. It's not unreasonable to suggest events at the Basin Reserve laid the foundation for what followed. Confidence and self-belief grew to a point future New Zealand teams knew they could match their more celebrated opponents. For that they should be grateful to the 11 from the Basin who had demonstrated what was possible. Collinge moved to Sydney 24 years ago. One day a chap tapped him on his shoulder. "I know you," the stranger said. "Do you remember the striker at the Basin Reserve Test?" I said I did, and he said it was me, Collins recalled. "He lives down my way and we had a catch-up. We'd knocked over Boycott and Miller, and he said to his mates, if Collins gets another wicket he'll streak." Derek Randall came and went. Naked man hurdling the fence at the northern end. He ran across the field, out the southern gate, turned left, went round the side of the basin where his mates threw his clothes over the top of the fence. He got dressed and went back in the northern end gate. They said, "Where's your ticket?" He said he misplaced it, and they let him back in. Which goes to show even the gatekeepers were caught up in the exhilaration of one of New Zealand cricket's most famous days.